Hello and welcome to the Remaining Sane, Finding Peace in Our Chaos podcast, a podcast about both theology and police work. I'm your host, Will, and in today's episode, I interview a pastor turned missionary, Mr. Grady Davidson. Grady, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Will. Good to be with you.
Good. Before we get started, would you mind giving us just a background, who is Grady Davidson, where is he from, all that?
Sure, Will. I grew up in Southwest Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia, and went to King College in Bristol, Tennessee. From there, went pretty much straight into seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary, which then turned into about 8 to 10 years of doing several different things before becoming ordained as a minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And since that time, I've spent most of my adult life, 21 years, as the pastor of a small EPC congregation here in Chattanooga.
So if we say EPC, that's going to mean?
Evangelical Presbyterian Church.
Okay. So for those of us that are maybe not Presbyterians, what in the realm of Presbyterians? So there's different, I guess, denominations of Presbyterians. Is that correct?
Certainly.
Okay. So the EPC is one of those, and I know I believe like the most popular or the most well known in the U.S. would be like the PCUSA, right? Like that's the most widespread.
That's correct. The EPC is one of a number of smaller Presbyterian and Reformed denominations in North America. I suppose our distinctive is that we have what we call 7 essentials of the faith, that we start from a standpoint of here are bedrock essentials, not just of being Presbyterian, but of being a Christian at all. And we find agreement in those points, and then beyond that, we do require of our officers subscription to the Westminster Standards. If you have exceptions to it, then each court of the church can review that exception. But we do try to be a little bit bigger tent in some ways while agreeing on the essentials of historic Orthodox Christianity.
Okay. All right. Well, moving away from just a religious history,
Sure.
right? You currently, you're kind of in a transition, from what I understand right now, right? You're moving away from being, a pastor of a parish, a church, whatever you want to say, a congregation, into being a missionary. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I was a pastor in one place, as I mentioned, for 21 years, and now I'm embracing a new role doing non-formal pastoral training in the majority world, and still kind of on the front end of learning what that's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that, we've talked about this before, in some ways, law enforcement and pastoral work do have some similarities. I believe that it's a calling. I believe both law enforcement and police work are callings. They're vocations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You don't do them for the money. You don't do them for the fame, or even today's culture, you don't do them for like societal gain. You do them because you feel called to do that.
Absolutely.
One of the hurdles I think that cops have is that and I assume this is true with pastoral work as well, is that a couple of years in, we don't become so enamored with the work itself, right? Like we start, the work becomes tedious, or the vocation becomes work, and then we forget why we started it, right?
That's why they call it work. It is work, and it can be tedious, and it can. There are days and weeks when you wake up and ask, okay, what am I doing, and why am I doing it, and am I in the right place? Why should I continue doing in this? And certainly in our respective fields, and perhaps in every field, you reach those points where you're looking across the fence and wondering, is the grass greener over there? Should I try to jump the fence, or do I stay in my current pasture, so to speak?
Yeah, there's even another parallel there. I think that a lot of officers, because of the way that the law enforcement works in the U.S., how we have like municipalities, or for the most part, especially where we are in the Southeast, there's not like a lot of big state agencies that respond directly to calls. So for what I'm getting to is, like, for example, like Pennsylvania State Police, or I think even the New York State Troopers, they respond directly to calls. They function as like this big police department
Right.
over all the rural areas of
Right.
the state. Down here, for the most part, individual sheriffs do that, or you have small municipalities, that have 4-man, 5-man departments, right?
Right.
And so a lot of times there's this tug and pull between different agencies, and you kind of wonder, is the grass greener on this end?
Right.
These guys pay just a hair more than these guys. Should I go over here? But one of the things that I've heard you talk about before is your spiritual gift of plotting, and that, I think, lines up really well with police work, because a lot of times, I know that I struggle with this, is that we can find ourselves really susceptible to wanting to change and continue to go in different directions, and not continue just to work at the same thing. Would you mind defining what plotting is, and how that turns into I guess like a spiritual gift for you?
Sure. So I coined that phrase, the spiritual gift of plotting, probably 15 years ago, to describe my ministry style. And it was, I probably first said it in answer to questions concerning why are you, quote unquote, still at a small church. I've definitely felt some pressure and expectation after I've been at a small local parish for about 5 years. I felt some pressure from the outside, from well-meaning mentors and others who were encouraging me to begin looking around, and there was almost a vocational expectation that a younger pastor, at that time in my early to mid-30s, that you put in your time in a small place and then you go to a little bit bigger place, and there was a sense of climbing the ladder, that there was an expectation of that. So I began using that phrase, I have the spiritual gift of plotting, just to say that I really do think I'm at my best when I do the same work routinely and faithfully, and without feeling the need to be looking around or trying to go elsewhere. And there's a quotation from my father that reference sometimes. He had a saying that, well, I guess I'll just keep on hoeing my row of taters. And so you look down the long row of potatoes in the garden, and there's corn behind you, and there's beans on the other row. But if you're assigned to hoe your row of taters, then you best just keep doing what you're assigned to do until you really know that it's time, that you've finished your row and it's time to look at a different one. So spiritual plotting, I think of the book of Ecclesiastes, where the teacher, the Kohelet, Solomon, he tries all kinds of different ventures looking for fulfillment, and experiments with human relationships and with the party scene and with industry and commerce, and everything seems to turn to ashes. And then he observes, if you'll notice, if you carefully read Ecclesiastes, he has a special admiration for the laborer who makes a daily wage and isn't going to get very far ahead in life, and yet that laborer who goes to work every day takes pride and joy in his work and does the work for the glory of God, goes home with his daily bread, his coin of daily bread in his pocket, and enjoys dinner and time with his family, and goes to bed and sleeps well. And I think that's the idea, that's a picture of spiritual plotting, that it really is about contentment of heart, to be where you are and to be a faithful presence where you are. And something you and I have discussed before, Will, is incarnational ministry and embodiment. You use the word embodiment, which I think is it's a spiritual idea. We often speak of incarnation, that we are just embodied as image bearers of God where we are, and there is glory brought to God and joy to be experienced just in faithfully doing what you're called to do, and doing it maybe for a long time.
Yeah, you're speaking my language here. This is this is something that we talked about before with Ecclesiastes. I mean, we especially reference this with Dr. Barnard. Is the human tendency to become nihilistic and to strive for the next thing, and this whole podcast is based around the fact that a lot of police officers tend to find their eternal purpose or their eternal the reason for which they exist in their police work. And police work is good, and the things that Koheleth chases in Ecclesiastes, some of them are good things. He does mention justice, he mentions virtue in Ecclesiastes, but once again, we're never going to like reach the end of police work. We're never going, and neither are we going to reach the end of
right.
Of being a pastor, right? I don't believe we're ever going to have everyone churched, right? And on top of that, everyone growing in their in the fullness of the body of Christ, right? And so I imagine sometimes it can, especially doing your job as long as you did it, it could feel nihilistic or empty sometimes, and you really have to center yourself on what your calling is and what Christ has told you to do, and being content with that, right?
Right, and you're using language from the Christian spiritual tradition, certainly when you talk of centering yourself, not in a mystical way, but of knowing how to pray, how to get your head back on straight. In the world of pastoral ministry, especially if you're a solo pastor who preaches every week, Mondays are proverbially difficult days, and I would joke with my wife on Mondays, keep me away from tall trees and short ropes. It's Monday. But you get through Monday and start looking ahead to what's next, and it's a new week and new opportunities. And so in terms of nihilism and despair, I don't think you and I have really talked about this before, Will, but I imagine that there are some similarities between law enforcement officers and clergy in terms of some of the traps that we can fall into. Of different ways that we act out, or different ways of different sins of the flesh and of the spirit, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, that trio that you get from the writings of John. And so you have to address those and recognize them. And in an earlier episode, I can't remember who you were interviewing, but there was discussion, I believe, of confession and the importance of that. And certainly for law enforcement officers, frankly, cops do have a lot of liberty out there on the street. And of course, that's probably not as great now in the day of cell phones where everyone's carrying a camera, but just a few short years ago, cops did have a lot of liberty in making arrests and in how things went down.
Yeah. Well, even in our judicial system now, police officers still do have a lot of liberty, right? Yeah. I believe in, once again, some lawyer may correct me on one minor thing, but from what I understand, there are certain misdemeanor crimes where a police officer has to arrest. So that would be like a DUI or domestic assault. But for some misdemeanor crimes, especially if they're crimes against society, like driving on a revoked license or driving without a seatbelt, we don't have to arrest somebody for those.
Right.
Or even for higher class crimes, right? Like if we technically, if we were to get assaulted and we didn't want to press charges, we wouldn't have to, right? There is that liberty. I don't know of any police officer who's going to get hit and then not arrest the person.
Right.
But that liberty does exist. But even on top of that, one of the things I want to get to is we also have social expectation, right? If someone who is I don't want to demean people that maybe work in the private sector, but if a police officer gets arrested or a pastor gets arrested, it's getting on the news.
Right.
Right. We've had our fair share of cops get arrested.
Right.
And then I'm sure pastors that have been arrested or got
Certainly.
caught doing bad
Certainly.
things, and it makes the news, right? And I think that can really take a toll on you. And especially if that sin is building up and you're not confessing it, you're not
Right.
praying, then it just builds up. Grady, you did mention that one of the things that has helped you is centering and praying. I want to ask you, how do we properly pray, especially when it comes to centering ourselves back on Christ?
I can only describe my practice, and my practice, like for anyone who has been a believer and pursued Christ over the years, your practices will change and morph over time. Where I'm at right now, a non-negotiable 7 days a week is a morning devotional time. Because of my particular calling, I think that my devotional time, which combines reading and study of Scripture, memorization of Scripture, and then prayer, all sometimes guided and sometimes extemporaneous, and I can loop back to that distinction. But I think that because of my calling, that should be a weighty part of my day, and I probably spend more time in that than most people would have the freedom or the ability to do. And then in the last, just since 2019, I've been very intentional about having a midday time of prayer, in which I use a modified liturgy that I've memorized for a short memorized prayer that then leads into some extemporaneous prayer, and I can do that driving from one place to the other or just pausing at lunchtime, and generally that's going to be 3 to 5 minutes. But for that midday prayer, again, you're asking how to do it. It will include reciting a psalm and reciting the Lord's Prayer, and then out of that growing into some extemporaneous prayers of concerns of the day. And then I try also to fall asleep in prayer at night, which I think is a God-glorifying thing to do, that if you drift off to sleep last thing in the day, talking to the Heavenly Father in the name of Christ, then I think that's a good thing to do. And I also have a memorized liturgy kind of my own creation for the end of the day that I try to end with. But if you ask the question, how do you pray? If perhaps someone's listening who sincerely wants to pray but just doesn't have an existing prayer life, I would say start by making sure you know the Lord's Prayer, and begin with that and pray it slowly, and let the petitions of the Lord's Prayer then guide you into thoughts that lead into your own extemporaneous prayers. And I would encourage you also to find somebody whose prayer life you admire and ask if you can pray with them once or twice a week. And prayer is more caught than taught, I find. And so find someone whose prayer life you admire and try to catch the fire from them.
Yeah, I think prayer also is a hard thing to nail down, right? Like it is definitely something that you need to learn how to do, and there are people who are quote unquote better at it than you are. Like I know people that are. My mom's a really good example of someone who's
Right.
really good at praying all the time and doing it well. But if you don't know what you're doing, then it can go south really quick. And so you do have to be guided in it. But also there is an element of prayer that is very personal. It's a very, very hard thing to really nail down. But once again, if you're just starting out, this is your first time doing it, 10 years, looking for prayers of, first of all, the way God taught us to pray,
right?
Lord's Prayer. And then on top of that, looking for, ancient prayers or the
Yes.
way that the first saints taught us how to pray. I think those are really good prayers. One of the things that I will do is in the end of Confessions. Confessions is a book by St. Augustine. St. Augustine of Hippo was he was a scholar turned priest in the Carthage area of the Roman Empire as Rome was falling. But at the end of Confessions, at the last two paragraphs, last paragraph, he'll ask for God. He'll either thank God for taking him out of something, or he'll ask God to give him, wisdom or guidance with something. And those are good, very good prayers.
Yes.
Because they're the same prayers that someone, before you is praying.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
Grady, before we take a break, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind giving an example of, this can, I want to kind of open this up, but give an example of a time where you really had to use prayer to recenter yourself back into ministry. You're having a rough time and you needed to go back into it.
Only every single day, really. And prayer really is like breathing as you grow in the Lord. And again, I can't name a particular time because it really is every day. And so here's just an example from the last 2 or 3 days. Driving from A to B just on a routine day, and I'm clicking through the local radio stations on the dial and going from one station I like to another, and I land on a station. I'm listening to some things that there's a part of me that's enjoying, and then the Spirit is whispering, but that's not really all that edifying for you right now, is it? And in a way I would not have done 10 years ago. I just clicked it off and let that prompt to do that lead me back into prayer. Rather than listening to this garbage, Lord, I have this moment of solitude, let me just spend it with you. And I can say that by the grace of God, I have grown in those things considerably.
Yeah, I think that that's a good example of something that we talk about. If you go to a police academy, you more than likely have heard the term or something around the term combating weakness. So when you find yourself being weak, or you find yourself, I can't do this, having a mentality change and doing something to actively combat that. So that is a quote unquote spiritual example, but I wouldn't say all the way spiritual, because prayer is something physical. You actually do it. Right. That a good physical example of that is one of the practices I have is that if I have a thought for the day, I really don't feel like, if I have a day planned where I'm going to go to the gym, and then I have some kind of thought that, I don't want to go to the gym, I'm just feeling lazy, or I just don't want to do it, and then I will, for having that thought,
right,
I will get on the ground and crank out push-ups.
Amen.
Because you need to punish that sloth,
yes,
or whatever,
yes,
right when it happens, right? We're going to take just a quick break, and we'll be right back. Alrighty, and we're back.
Hey, Will, I really appreciated what you were saying about your self-discipline when you even have a thought of skipping your workout day, and may we apply those things spiritually as well. Jesus talked about if your right eye causes you to sin, you deal with it pretty radically. He says you tear it out and throw it away. Now, of course, in that same passage, without getting in the weeds of the Sermon on the Mount, he does tell us that these things are really matters of the heart, first of all. But it's interesting that Jesus gives that sort of embodied response. Deal with your physical body to beat down those issues in the heart. But anyway, I was reminded of a couple of years ago. I was on sabbatical, and in my sabbatical journeys, I got to go to Montana for about 2 weeks, and I met this wonderful gentleman who he runs a couple of small gem mines in Montana, and he has a gem store, and he was featured on one of the cable gemstones. Yes. He was featured on one of the shows. I can't remember which one it was, but he was real proud of that, and he had pictures from the filming of that on his walls in his store. But he said this. He said, "Do today who you want to be tomorrow. Do today who you want to be tomorrow." And wow, that's one to take home and to use for the rest of your life. Whatever practices need to happen to become the person that you want to become, start it today, and that will shape your tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing I've also noticed is my whole spiritual journey, the whole reason that I got back into Christianity was a physical. I think I've told this before, but the way in which I think. I've got a bunch of family who are professors, right? And so my family and, I tend to think very intellectually, and that's not to say that, I'm thinking smarter than other people, but the way in which I see the world is very much through my brain and, not through quote unquote my body. That's just how I see the world. Right. But it was only when I realized that I have a body as well that means something, that I really started to appreciate what Christ teaches, because my whole background is that when I was in high school, I got obese. I was very, very heavy, and I needed to lose all that weight, and I without consulting anybody else, I just figured out a way. I was going to drop all this weight. I was eating 1,200, 1,400 calories a day. Once again, if you need to lose weight, don't do that. Do not do it that way. That was not a smart decision. But I did take weight off. I took a lot of weight off very quickly. I've since learned how to maintain a good amount of weight. And I've got certain ways I've done. I've learned a lot since then. But I'm still learning. I still have someone that helps me out with that, who teaches me about nutrition. But you do need guidance with this. But I realized when I was losing that weight that if I really want my life to change, I have to have some agency and get up and do something about it. I can't just sit around. We joke about the lady who's in a hurricane, and she prays to God that God would save her, and he sends her a raft, and he sends her a boat, and sends her a helicopter, and sends her a plane, and she's like, God, why didn't you save me? He's like, I tried to save you 4 times. Right. You have to. God works in this world because he created it. I think it's very rare that we find that he does something extremely supernatural. It can happen. I believe it does happen. I think that the greatest example of that right now would be like Eucharistic miracles, where the elements become the actual
Yes.
body and blood, but we don't see that every day. It's not an everyday occurrence. So we have to look around us, and if we want to make changes to our family life, our personal life, spiritual life, whatever, we have to get up and do them.
Right. And as a pastor, talking to perhaps cops who are listening, because I think it'll be mainly law enforcement officers who will be picking up this podcast. Number one, I admire you and I appreciate you so much for your difficult, often thankless work. Thank you for being who you are and where you are. You really are that thin blue line between civilization and chaos, and in a way that most people don't understand. But we do know, as I'm just speaking right now pastorally to possible law enforcement officers out there, we do know that the stereotype of cops having a difficult family life and struggling in marriage and with child raising and with immorality, that those stereotypes are there for a reason, that there are tendencies there. And if you're not happy with where your marriage and your family life is landing, then today, you be the one, pick up the phone, make the appointment with a counselor. You be the one to plan the date night with your wife. Do something, move on it. It's not going to fix itself, and I think that's part of what you're driving at there, Will.
Well, transitioning just a little bit, one of the things that I want to talk about specifically, this applies to, so it wouldn't apply to federal or even some state guys, but for the local cop, right? You were a pastor at a parish for 20 plus years in a small town local area. The nobility of working in a local community. One of the things that there are some, so the department I work for is bigger, but there are some guys that have worked the same beat I know one guy who's worked the same beat 15 years.
Wow. Yes.
The exact same area, 15 years. And so he knows that area really well.
And the people know him by name, and he's been there long enough that he's had encounters with lots of folk, and he's proven himself over time. And there is a beauty and a strength that can only be proven over time like that. I love that.
Yeah. And I wanted to
Sure.
get into that more, right? I think that a lot of times we think that making great sweeping change or having some new policy or having a new law is going to fix local communities. And I do think that there's a place for that, but I think at the end of the day, personal investment or a long time investment to make long sustainable change in a community is what is going to reap the most benefits. Not trying to get just economical with it. Not trying to say, if I put this amount of time, I'm going to get this much benefit. But just being happy with where you are and making small change. And I think you've got a lot of experience here because you worked in the same community for 20 plus years. Would you mind talking a little bit more about the importance of having people that stay in a certain area for a long time?
One of my favorite subjects that you're touching on, so thanks for the opportunity. Will, I'm convinced that especially coming out of COVID and coming out of the lockdown and the insanity there that went for a big 18 months or more, that what we're seeing across the board in American society anyway is a newly rediscovered, a rediscovered appreciation of the local, of the neighborhood, of your part of town. And we see this in church life. I've talked with big church pastors and with small church pastors in several different places, and there's a general consensus that yes, in ministry, that people have a rediscovered appreciation of their own street and their own neighborhood, and so we are in church life. I think we are rediscovering that old notion of parish, of having a parish ministry, whereas again in American Christianity for certainly since the 80s, Well, I believe the driving model was that of the big suburban church, that people drive away from home and drive 20 minutes to get out to the big Walmart church outside of town. And I do think there is a renewed love of the local church in the neighborhood, and the parallel with law enforcement and with school, I think, goes hand in hand with that. In terms of law enforcement, this is your area of expertise, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think back probably in the 50s and 60s, now quite some years ago, in the larger metropolitan areas, that it was common for there to be beat cops who were on their hoofs, walking the sidewalks, the same neighborhoods day after day after day. And then perhaps in the 80s, if not before, because of cutbacks and needing to stretch personnel more, the local precinct started putting cops in cars. And now you can patrol not just 5 blocks, but 8 blocks, because you're just driving around. And from what I've heard, I think that was a shift in the way police interacted with the community and with the community perception of the police.
Yes, not only was that a change in just law enforcement, but that was also a change in how city structures were put together. A really good example of this is, I believe, would be the city of Nashville. So from what I understand, the city of Nashville in the 60s or in the 70s and the 80s started acquiring a bunch of small towns around it. It eventually has grown to be the Nashville Metro. That's how Nashville's run now, is a big metro.
Right.
And the police department it's a city-county thing. It's not just, we have city and the county sheriff. The county sheriff runs the jail, and the city runs the police for the whole county of Davidson County. The city's transitioned away from, maybe having a bigger city of, a couple 100,000 people and then having a bunch of small towns around it, to that bigger city acquiring all the small towns.
Right.
And so
annexation.
Yes. Yeah. There was a lot of annexation back then. And so it got rid of a lot of police departments.
Yes.
Because, even in rural areas, you have a 1-2-man department, but that 1-2-man department in the 50s and the 60s would have one guy with boots and a cover and would be walking Main Street back and forth.
Right.
And so, there was the advent of cars and air conditioning led to, a decentralization of stuff. Whether that be church, whether that be just the communities that we interact in. That's cars really took that away, and then suburbs also kind of.
Yes.
You did have communities inside of suburbs, but that took away everyone living on the same, especially where you're from.
It took away the Main Street feel of America.
Yeah.
And it changed the way law enforcement and church both were done, and schools.
Yeah.
What you were describing just now with police, with the way police organized, certainly the school systems in many places did the same thing and became the huge county or city systems that we have inherited today.
Yeah, heck, I'd argue that it's also changed how neighborhoods are run, how your community is run. So from what I understand, you grew up real small town Virginia.
Yes.
I bet you knew everyone who lived on your street, and you're the parents on everyone on that street could equally punish you for doing something stupid as your own parents could.
Right.
And it applied the same way to other kids.
Right.
There was a higher amount of trust with our fellow neighbors.
Right.
Right. And I think that having a high amount of trust in your community is something essential for law enforcement. And I think that the areas where you find little trust between your community members and also between the cops and the community itself is where you get just a mess of crime. And we don't want that, right? We don't want dysfunction. We want everyone to have an ordered, functional, prosperous life. And when I say prosperous, I don't mean just economically prosperous, but I mean just a good life that glorifies God.
Flourishing.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think it's important that, as police officers, we take the time to do smaller things and, reinvest in the community members that we've been entrusted with, right? There's a couple families that I'll visit about once a month, and because something real bad's happened, and I try to just make sure everyone's doing okay, make sure that everyone is, we're not going back to what happened,
Right.
Way back when I responded. And I think that my going there, it may remind them in like a kind of a negative way what happened that day, but it's also, I don't really want them to associate me with that event. I want them to associate me with, or the police with, something good happening.
Yes.
A change happening for the good, right?
Right.
And I think that me going back there helps that. It helps remind them of, okay, we're not going to do this anymore, or we're not going to have this bad experience again. We've made a change. Let's follow through on this. Maybe it's a little bit of motivation or a reminder. Do you have any stories of long-term change that you saw? I'm sure you've got a few from having worked in a church for 20 years.
Well, in the church itself where I served, and I think people who were there with me for those 20 years would every single one would agree with what I'm about to say, that after pushing through about 7 years, that there was a cultural change within the church, a change of temperament that for the better, that could only happen because I stuck it out through that typical turnover time of about 3 to 5 years. And one of the most important studies that I did as a long-term pastor in a small church was when I finally went back and reviewed the church records, we call them minutes of session, and realized, this church does have a history of about every 4th year the pastor changes. And I certainly felt pressure around that 4th year. And it was almost like a default setting that the church about every 4 years was ready for somebody else. So there was a cultural change of we are in this for the long haul together that happened. And then because I was blessed to have what is more of a parish ministry than a big box store type church type ministry, and those are legitimate, and brothers and sisters who worship in the bigger, more resourced, more suburban type churches. Bless you. That just wasn't my calling for those 2 decades. But being able to do what I did in one place as a parish, just like you were talking about, Will, you have interactions with families. Often those interactions will begin with a death in the family, and maybe it's a family that really doesn't go to church anywhere, but historically there was some tie through their family to your church, and you get that call about helping with a funeral. And through that kind of thing, you start building bridges and relationships, and it just takes time to do that. In my world, Will, they say that it takes 7 years for a congregation to learn to trust a pastor. And when pastoral turnover is happening at less than 5 years, and I don't know what the data is now, but when you're never reaching that 7 years, it means that generations of people are never really learning to deeply trust their pastor. And so turning it back over to you, I wonder what that parallel is in law enforcement. What the tipping point is, we're in your precinct, which is very similar to a parish. Where is it? At what point do local people say, this officer, he is a trustworthy person. I can talk to him. I can speak truth without fear of him using it against me. How long does that take? And what does that look like?
What does it look like? Well, I'm going to get there first. I think just not lying to people. In law enforcement, if we're investigating a crime, sometimes it is advantageous for us to lie to somebody, and we can do it. I prefer not to do it, but sometimes we, there's nothing against us lying to someone
Right.
in an interview, right? We can do it, but I think that at the end of the day, doing the right thing is what I think that we're called to do, we're supposed to do. A good example of this is one time I was at I think it was on a traffic wreck, and some lady, her billfold had come out during the wreck, and a bunch of money went everywhere. And so I found $50 laying on the ground, and I walked up to her and was like, "Hey, is this your money?" You made sure it was in front of my camera and everything,
Yes.
but because I don't need to get accused of doing anything, but being beyond the shadow of a doubt that
Right.
you're being trustworthy, I think
Above reproach.
yes, above reproach. Then that's very important, because we are in a position of trust, right? We do
Yes.
pick up. If it'd be really easy if I wanted to take meth off people and start using it.
Right.
I'm not going to do that. There's nothing appealing to me about meth, but I definitely think that we do have an opportunity for that if we wanted to, right? For a time frame wise, how long that takes, I don't know. I hadn't been policing long enough, I think, for it to really see that. That'd be a good question to ask someone who's been doing this a hot minute, a lot longer than I have, at least 5 years. But I think that when people can, know you by name, or know that when you show up, you're not looking to just throw everybody in handcuffs. You're not looking to take the next person to jail for something petty. That you're looking to solve the problem. I think that's something that my team does a really good job of. Is that when we show up on something, we're not looking to throw the next person in jail. We're not looking to just really hem somebody up for something quote unquote small, right? Well, Grady, before we get done, I do want to ask you, do you have any counsel or advice for the listeners of this show?
Again, just looping back to the topic of confession and forgiveness as God's appointed tools for not just experiencing forgiveness for sin, but deliverance from sin's power, which I believe is very deeply a part of Christian theology, that by the power of the cross, we're not only forgiven sin's guilt, but we are delivered from sin's grip and its power. And so if as an officer, if you're finding yourself trapped in any of those sins that seem to follow the trade, confess it to death. It took me far too long in my life to learn that spiritual principle, that confession really is God's tool for breaking the grip and just saying, this is what it is. And of course, that means you have to have people in your life you can talk to and speak truthfully to, and vice versa, and to experience grace with one another. But yeah, just honesty. Honesty is a path to growth. And Will, you were talking about your own your high school experience of you let your body get out of shape. And you had a moment of raw honesty where you looked in the mirror and said, this is my problem. If it's going to be fixed, I've got to own it for what it is. And so there is just freedom in that honesty to say it is what it is, and to move forward, owning that and being responsible. The pathway, acceptance of the self is the beginning of change in yourself and of others. Raw honesty, this is what it is. I'm not hiding myself, but then that gives others freedom also. And so that's my call to freedom and confess. Let us confess our sins to death and trample on the bellies of our lusts, as one of the Puritans would say.
Freedom and not licentiousness, right?
Amen.
All right, Grady, thank you for coming on. If you have any questions, feel free to email remainingsanepodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's remainingsanepodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Remaining Sane PC. Have a blessed rest of your day.